Chapter 21. Brenda Wyatt was not above using the force to protect her. After all, what was the point in working for the cops if you were finicky about using them? She did not want to bother Moran, so she swallowed her pride and went to Bedso. "Brenda," said the bald-headed Bedso, knocking over a cup of coffee on his desk. "What can I do for you?" She looked at the coffee running down the desk top in alarm. "Hadn't you better mop that up first?" There were reports on his desk, and from the look of them, they would be unreadable if something was not done to stem the tide of brown liquid. Yeah, sure." He took some paper towels and cleaned up the worst of the mess. The soggy pieces were thrown into the waste bin, and then Bedso stood there awkwardly fiddling with his gun belt. "So, what can I do for you, Brenda?" She was beginning to wonder whether this was a good idea, but since she had gone this far. "I want you to do me a favor, Walt." Yeah, sure." "You don't know what it is yet." He smiled sheepishly. "It doesn't matter." "And there's no strings attached. You understand me?" He looked disappointed, and she felt a heel, but he smiled again, and the inevitable, "Yeah, sure," followed. However, there was no point in raising his hopes. "I've got someone coming to dinner tonight. Nash. Russell Nash." "The guy we picked up in the garden?" "Hey, Brenda, he's not clean yet. We've got nothing on him, but that doesn't mean he didn't do it. I wouldn't trust that guy as far as Mexico." She waited patiently for the tirade to finish, knowing she had to go through the big brother's protecting you bit before she could be allowed to speak again. "You've got to be careful with guys like that, Brenda." "Exactly, Walt. Which is why I came to you." Bedso drew himself up, tightened his gun belt, and sat on the edge of the desk, right in a pool of coffee. Brenda winced. "I wondered if you'd stake out for me, just in case I need assistance. I want to pump him for some information, and if you're outside on call, I won't feel so frightened." Bedso was a fool about women, but not where his job was concerned. "Does Moran know about this? You're way out of line here, Brenda. You know that." "This is not about the case, Walt. This is about antiques. I wouldn't interfere in your work. You know that." "Let me get this straight. You want to pump this guy Nash for some information about antiques. Nothing to do with the case, right? And because of his recent activities, you would feel safer if someone was on call." "That's exactly it, Walt." He walked around the desk, tapping his fingers. "Still sounds a bit out of line, Brenda." "Moran wouldn't like it." "And if I was a man," she snapped, "then it would still be out of line." "No. Shit. Okay. When do you want me there?" She felt relieved. She was just about ready to give the whole thing up. 8:30. No, you'd better get there a bit earlier. Say 8, this evening. She went to the supermarket after that to get the food they were to eat, then back to work for the rest of the day. When she got back to her apartment in the early evening, she set the place up as she wanted it. Her father had bought her a Smith & Wesson .38 before leaving for Florida, telling her she couldn't be too careful in New York City, with all those weirdos that hung around the square. The pistol was now loaded for the first time and placed in the top drawer of her writing bureau. Then there was the tape recorder in her father's old cigar box. Finally, she began to prepare for dinner. At 8 o'clock, she looked out of the window and saw Walter's car already parked on the far side. Good old reliable Walt. She still felt guilty about using him. Still, he was on stakeouts all the time. This sort of thing was a busman's holiday. At 8:17, the front doorbell rang. She yelled, "Wait a minute!" took off her apron and started the tape recorder. Then she went to the door, checking with the spy hole first to make sure it was Nash. He stepped inside the room. "Good evening." "Hi, let me take your coat." Not too eager, she thought, not too gushing. The guy will know that there's something going on, other than dinner. She stood, staring at him for a while, wondering what to say next. "I think I'll hold on to my coat, thanks," he said. Really? She thought. What does he think I'm going to do with it? Throw it out the window? "Oh, fine," she said. "You want to dine in the hall, or shall we step inside?" he said. "Oh, come in." He walked into the room and sat down, picking up a magazine that she had dropped on the floor. He tossed it onto the opposite chair. "Would you make us some drinks?" she said, "while I put the finishing touches to the supper." "Okay. What would you like?" "I'll have a dry martini. The drinks cabinet is over there. You'll find the olives in there too." She went into the kitchen then. A little while later, he brought a martini to her, and she said, "Thanks." When she began carrying the food into the living room, he was standing by the window, looking down at the street. Damn him, what was he doing? "Do you know what you're doing?" she thought, with herself in mind. "Interesting view," he said. She laughed, a little too tinkling. "Yes, a good old New York skyline." He nodded at the rest of the room as he walked away from the window. "I like your place, Brenda." She said, "I've only been here 3 months. I'm still fixing it up. I used to live with my father, but he's retired now. Florida." "Lucky man." She laughed. "That's a funny thing to say. He's not lucky. He just waited till he got old. That's all." "Is that all he did?" This conversation was leaving her behind a little, and she decided to change the subject. "That woman who works for you, Rachel." "Yes. She's very attractive." "Yes, she is, isn't she? And you're wondering whether we have a relationship outside that of the business." "No, I was not," cried Brenda hotly. "Oh, but you were. And you're quite right. We've been together for a long time. I'm her adopted son." Brenda kicked herself mentally. Ouch. Why did she always assume the wrong things? "Your mother works for you." Anything wrong in that? When she thought about it, there wasn't. If the guy's mother wanted to work for her adopted son, why not? "You never told me what you do for a living," said Nash. Oh, Christ, here it comes, the whole police bit. "I work for the Metropolitan Museum, in acquisitions. That's why I wanted to talk to you." "Ah, that explains your interest in ancient weapons." She nodded furiously. "Right." He held up his glass. "Do you mind if I have another drink?" "Help yourself." "Thanks." He poured himself another brandy while Brenda began to serve the meal. Well, he'd fallen for that line very easily. Maybe it wasn't going to be such a difficult job after all. If she could lay her hands on that sword, her father would be ecstatic. She wondered what the weapon meant to Nash, if he had it. If he did have it, she reminded herself, then he was the one who killed Faisal in the garden garage. That would make him a murderer. Unless he had been defending himself, as he had done the night they encountered that giant with the broadsword. She preferred to believe that version. Perhaps he had been on his way back to his shop with the sword when another guy with a Toledo Salamanca just happened to be passing by and decided to mug. Hell, she wanted to think he was a straight guy, but the alternatives just didn't add up. They ate the first course, and she opened a bottle of wine to have with the second. "Do you mind if I stick with the brandy?" "Suit yourself," she said. "How about a toast to the samurai sword?" He raised an eyebrow. "That's a peculiar toast. I'd rather drink to this brandy." He sniffed the glass. "Bottled in 1783. "Old," she said. He replied quietly, 1783 was a very good year. Mozart wrote his great Mass. The Montgolfier brothers went up in their first balloon, and England recognized the independence of the United States." "Is that right?" "Yes. And now?" He pulled a package out of his raincoat pocket and placed it on the table. "What's that?" she asked. "It's for you." "Can I open it?" "That's the general idea." She could feel it was a book, and she wondered what on earth he had thought of bringing her. Something on swords, perhaps. He did not know enough about her to think of anything else. She tore away the wrapping. She was right. It was a book about swords. Her own book. "You bastard," she said, dismayed. "Where did you find this?" "I work in the business. You seem to forget. It wasn't difficult." He stood up and walked to the window, pushing aside the blind and looking down at the street. "The odd thing is, your bio doesn't seem to mention that you work at the museum. It says you work for the police, in forensics. Are you a Moran trying to set me up?" "I don't work for Moran. Not directly." She began to edge casually towards the bureau. Her stomach was like a lump of lead. "Then why," said Nash, "is that bald policeman sitting outside, watching your apartment?" She tilted her head back, putting on her "I don't know what the hell you're talking about" look. Nash looked back at her and smiled. "Oh, come on. You remember him." "It's got nothing to do with Moran. I asked Bedso to watch my place tonight while you were here. Frankly, Mr. Nash, or Mr. MacLeod, whatever your name is, I don't trust you. Why should I? I know nothing about you." She paused as he walked away from the window and back to the table. The bureau was within reach now. She said, "What are you going to do?" He smiled. "The question is, what are you going to do? Are you going to turn off the tape, or are you going to shoot me with the .38? She stared at him. Oh, shit. He must have looked in the drawers and the cigar box while she was in the kitchen fixing supper. She felt unjustified in her accusation, but she made it anyway. "You've been snooping in my cupboards." He held up a hand. "Guilty. But I didn't rifle through your underwear. I'm not into that. Not yet, anyway." He grinned. She punched the arm of her chair in frustration. "Why are you so goddamn nice? If you're a killer..." She looked up quickly to see his reaction. "I'm not looking for a killer," she said. "I'm looking for a sword." "Which sword?" The one used on Faisal. I found pieces of it in the garage under the garden. I only want to see the samurai. Why? Because it's not supposed to exist. It's one of those myths of the antique world. She could not keep the passion out of her voice. I dated those pieces of the blade at 600 BC. The metal had been folded 200 times. And? So, the Japanese did not start making swords like that until the Middle Ages. So where the hell did it come from? If I could verify the existence of such a weapon, it would be like discovering a 747 1,000 years before the Wright brothers ever flew. This is crazy. Nash got to his feet, grabbed his coat, and began to walk towards the door. She suddenly felt intensely irritated with him. Hell, he had invited himself to dinner, and they had only just got started on the second course. There was apricot pie to go yet. "Wait a minute," she said. "I want some answers." He stared at her, so coldly that it frightened her. "You want. Don't you ever think about anything but what you want? Don't you think that if I had that sword, and I say if, that it would be my discovery, not yours?" He opened the door and slammed it shut behind him. Brenda sighed. Well, there was no need to keep Walt outside in the car. She went to the window and signaled to him. 10 minutes later, he came bounding into the room. "Is he still here?" he cried. "Calm down, Walter. He's gone. Didn't you pass him?" "No. He must have taken the elevator. I came up by the stairs." He stood looking at her with puppy dog eyes. "Since you're here," she said, "would you like some apricot pie? I'm usually lousy at making it, and just today I got it right for once. Then my guest walks out on me before we get to it." Bedso stayed for about a quarter of an hour and polished off the pie. Then he left. Brenda settled down to watch the news on the TV. There was nothing about beheadings. For once.